Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to our webinar presentation discussing navigating the glass and concrete ceiling. If this is your first webinar, welcome, and I would like to just quickly introduce myself before we get started. My name is Amanda Henty, and I am the Alumni Professional Development Coordinator here at St. Louis University. Just a brief background, I suppose. I started my role in this position in July of 2015. And since then, I have been working on establishing and strengthening different alumni professional development programming. And this webinar series is a part of that initiative. So welcome. Um, just some minor housekeeping things. Our presentation today will be recorded and available for viewing early next week. I'll have that up on our SLU YouTube page. And I will also send out an email to you when that is available. And um, we'll also be sharing the slides as well from today's presentation. So don't feel like you have to do crazy note taking as we present. You will be just fine. The chat feature will also be available throughout the entire presentation. Feel free to send in questions as we're speaking, but we are going to take questions at the end, so don't feel like I'm not answering your questions. We will just save time as much as we can at the end. And I also, if you have technical issues, I'm going to ask that you call GoToWebinar directly. They usually can fix things really quickly, and I have shared that phone number with you in the chat box if you need that. And now I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lubna Somji. Dr. Somji is a 1993 Arts and Sciences alum and a licensed psychologist and executive coach. Welcome, Dr. Somji.
Thanks so much, Amanda. It's good to be back again this year.
Yeah.
All right, so shall we dive in?
Yep, I'm gonna switch you over. Switch presenters really quick.
All right,
Bear
are you
with
able to
us.
see my screen?
Yep,
Perfect.
looks good.
So unfortunately, once again this year, I have a cough and I apologize in advance, but it is what it is. Hopefully we'll muddle through.
Yeah.
So I wanted to actually start by sharing a brief story that I think helps illustrate why this topic is so important to be discussing. About 5, 6 years ago, I attended a large conference in New York City. And at one point, the attendees were encouraged to come to the ballroom for some announcements and things like that. So I head over to the ballroom and I end up doing what a lot of people are doing, which is kind of milling around in the back until things get started. I was waiting for a couple of friends when all of a sudden this man approached me, and he was also a conference attendee. And he then proceeded to inform me that we were very low on drinks in the back, and could I please make sure that more drinks were available, and could I also at the same time get him a cup of coffee. So I was a little bit stunned and also irritated because clearly he thought I was wait staff. And as he walked away, he motioned for me where he was sitting so that I could get him his coffee. And I just sort of smiled and nodded. And the reason, and shortly after, my friends came and I sat down in the conference. And the reason I didn't really say anything to him was because I knew that in about 20 minutes or so, I was going to be called up in front of the ballroom and I was going to be presented with an award. And I have to say that it was a pleasure to see his face drop when I walked up there to get my award. This is just one of many examples of what women face on a very regular basis in professional settings, including the workplace. Obviously, sometimes it's much more obvious, sometimes it's much more subtle. And nowadays, many workplaces are talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion, or what I'll refer to going forward as D&I. And yet we still continue to see inequities. So today we're specifically going to be talking about women and both the glass and concrete ceiling. The glass ceiling, as you know, is the barrier that keeps women from advancing, especially to higher level positions. And the concrete ceiling is a similar barrier, but it is much less penetrable, and it applies typically to women of color who even have greater difficulty breaking through. The problem is that these barriers not only lead to inequities, but they don't allow individuals and businesses to thrive, because embracing diversity and inclusion, or D&I, is really an opportunity to grow and thrive, which can be an exciting path to building a better business culture, to increasing innovation, increasing market share, and yes, even creating a more robust bottom line. And so the reality is we all miss out when we don't address the barriers that women face in the workplace. So today we're going to be talking mostly about what women can do to navigate the workplace despite these barriers. But the reality is that while women can do some things, we all need to address this issue. So I'll also be talking a bit at the end about what allies and what leadership also need to be doing. And remembering that diversity really isn't enough, that it's really about diversity and inclusion. People often ask me what the difference is between the two. And there's this great metaphor that I came across a couple of years ago. I'm not sure who coined it because every time I hear it, it's attributed to a different person. But the metaphor goes something like this. Diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to dance. So I'm going to have you guys kind of think back, just to start out, about high school, especially if you went to a high school that was slightly larger. And I want you to think about if there were any cliques in your high school. There often are, especially in medium and large size high school. Amanda, I know you went to high school.
I
were
did.
there, were there any cliques in your particular high school?
I feel like ours was pretty stereotypical, of what you think of. We
Hmm.
had, um, the more athletic groups, the artsy groups.
Yeah.
Um,
Was there one group that you kind of had more of an affinity with than others?
um, I would say I was more with the artsy folks. I played band. I did a lot of art classes, so I was
Hmm.
more of that group of people.
Yep. My high school was the same. There were a lot of cliques, the jocks and the socialites, the nerds, the band people, the theater people. And I floated a little bit amongst a few groups, but the group that I felt most at home with was the sort of punk group, the goth group
Hmm.
with the black and the skateboard and
Yeah.
things like that, right? So the reason that high schools have cliques, well, there's obviously a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons has to do with something called affinity bias, um, which simply means that we tend to warm up to people who are like ourselves. And that's just human nature. If you have a brain, you have that bias. It means that we tend to show more empathy and sympathy towards people who are more similar to ourselves. And conversely, we tend to be a little bit more critical of those people who we feel are not similar to ourselves. So, how is this all relevant in the workplace? Well, women and women of color experience a lot of affinity bias along with lots of other things, and that sort of limits the advancement of them in the workplace, hence the glass and concrete ceiling. Women often face things like affinity bias, sexism, racism, microaggressions, implicit bias, things like that. And as you can see from the slide, the impact on women is the following. Obviously, there are pay differences. They're not as visible in top positions. We know that, for example, unemployment is higher amongst women versus men, even when their educational background is exactly the same. So there is clearly a huge impact on women. However, what we forget about is that science shows us that companies also take a hit in terms of, difficulty with attracting talent, high turnover, decreased innovation, and even the bottom line. So the reality is we all miss out when women are facing these barriers in the workplace. So what can we do? Well, I think one of the first things that's important to think about is to keep in mind the basic premise that D&I is an opportunity to develop thriving employees and companies or organizations. If equity were already in place, obviously we wouldn't need to be discussing this. And discussing aspects of D&I can be uncomfortable, but unfortunately, if we don't talk about it, we just maintain the status quo. And we often forget that really D&I is an opportunity to support people and to support companies to do and be their best. And it's really about developing more vibrant, thriving employees and organizations, which really should be an exciting premise for everyone in the workplace, especially leadership. Excuse me. So what can we do about it? So let's start with some things women can do, but let me sort of lay out a picture first of some of the experiences women have. So all of us, all women experience the workplace obviously very differently, some very positively, some less so. And for women, it's almost as if many are somehow invisible in the workplace and yet also hyper visible at the same time. Many times women, for example, are invisible. They're not seen or heard in meetings as often as men, unless of course someone else who's male says the same thing. Sometimes women end up having to work harder for the same credit, or they're not thought of for mentoring as often or larger projects. And sometimes women are not always part of informal groups. And those informal groups then create a situation where, you're excluded from those important conversations. So for example, I'm going to talk about some examples throughout actually this talk of previous executive coaching clients I've had. I have disguised a lot of the identifying information so that no one knows who they might be, because you never know, it's a small world. But a couple of years ago, I had a client who was in the financial sector. She was very good at what she did. She was recognized by her community and professional organization at the national level. And at one point, she had been invited to a volunteer committee in her community that was a bit of a high profile committee. And she had been on the committee for several months. But this client, she just didn't feel heard oftentimes. Her ideas were not considered. She and one other woman were the only women on this committee. And she found out shortly after that the men would often get together informally outside of committee meetings, over lunch or tennis or what have you. And, a lot of times committee discussions would happen and decisions would be made. So at one point during the committee meeting, the committee brought up that they wanted to develop this project and they had a financial question. And they were wondering who in the world in the community could help them with their question. And they kept discussing that and it went on. And she finally broke in and she said, remember, this is, what I do for a living. And they had completely forgotten. They had kind of just not seen her. She ended up, of course, helping them out with the project and did a stellar job. But that's sort of an example of how sometimes women are in some ways almost invisible. But women also tend to experience the flip side as well. Sometimes what you say or what you do may often be interpreted differently. Women asserting themselves, for example, can be seen differently than a man asserting themselves. A woman of color who speaks out sometimes can be seen as aggressive, even though her white counterparts might not. At one point, I had an executive coaching client who was a woman of color. And one day she was asked to come in and meet with her boss. She and her colleagues had actually been in the process of being trained to do a pretty complicated assessment. And they were doing lots and lots of practice tests. So the boss had called her into the office to point out that during one of her practice tests, actually her first one, she had made a small error. The boss then proceeded to scold her for 30 minutes about the error, gave her a very stern warning, and then began to micromanage all her work. And she was pretty shaken because this was a woman who actually did quite well in the workplace, was considered a little bit of a rising star. She confided to a colleague a few weeks later who happened to be a white woman. And much to her surprise, the colleague was shocked because the colleague had also been called into her boss's office. The colleague had actually made the same error because it was a complicated part of the assessment. The colleague had actually made a couple of other small errors, but again, these were all practice tests. Her boss, the same boss, simply pointed them out, let her know that she was doing a great job, and sent her on her way. So as you can see, sometimes women in the workplace are invisible and sometimes hypervisible. And these kinds of things happen on a very regular basis, and it creates almost sort of an emotional tax for women. It's exhausting. Dealing with these kinds of issues takes up a lot of mental space. Women can sometimes become discouraged or frustrated, and sometimes it results in women not always participating as much as they could just to avoid these kinds of daily insults. Science also shows that unfortunately this kind of thing also takes a toll on women's health as well as productivity. So the issue is, it's still important to show up to these systems that ultimately impact you. So how can you navigate this? In terms of self-care, there's a few things that can be done. One, I always advocate for picking your battles. If you don't pick your battles, you will end up not only exhausted and potentially burning out, but you may not continue to have influence, because if you speak up about every single thing, you could end up being completely shut out and not heard. So it's important to pick your battles and really ask yourself questions like, is this worth me speaking up? If I don't speak up, what might the implications be a month from now or 6 months from now? What are all the ways that I might be able to address this? Is it something that can be addressed by an ally on my behalf, especially if it's something more general? Can I instead propose a solution instead of addressing the issue? And how powerful is the person that I'm going to be addressing? And of course, what are the implications on my career? Now, I'm always an advocate of acting in line with your values and being bold and having courage. And sometimes it's going to be worth it to speak up to someone who has a lot of power and influence in your career, but sometimes it may not. So it's important to pick those battles. The other thing women can do is set limits. One of the things I've sort of noticed, and I don't know if you guys have, but a lot of times women are asked to do a lot of tasks that I consider housekeeping. Whether it's getting coffee for people, taking notes during a meeting, maybe even being asked to do someone else's job for a period of time. Mentoring others, that's a big one that certainly isn't exclusive to women, but women often get asked to mentor other people, which takes a lot of time. And so it's important to see if you can set limits with some of these things, and really ask yourself, is what I'm being asked to do, useful to the company in some way? Is it tied into some sort of revenue goal? Is it going to be useful to my career goal, and how? Is what I'm being asked to do, is there any way that I could tweak it so that it could be useful to me or my career? And can I get any credit for it? So for example, there was a woman that I worked with who often was asked to mentor early career professionals and new hires, and she actually did a great job of it, and it really ended up saving the company a lot of time and resources. And she negotiated to get credit for this towards promotions and salary. So she was able to kind of use it to her advantage and still continue doing something she genuinely enjoyed doing. So the third thing is passion and projects. If you want to be a high performer in the workplace and you want to be someone who doesn't burn out, it's really important to play hard. It's important to spend time with family and friends for sure, people you care about. And it's important to connect to passions or projects that help you feel either rejuvenated or empowered. And that could be something as simple as a hobby that you really enjoy doing and either have mastered or simply just do because it's enjoyable, whether it's working out, whether it's participating in a church or synagogue or mosque, or volunteering for a cause you love. I once worked with someone who did research, and a lot of her research was long-term research. So every day, it's not like she had small wins every day or every week or every month. And so one of the things that she did was volunteer for Habitat for Humanity, because it was this concrete thing that she could do, she could feel mastery over, and of course she felt really good about the cause as well. So really making sure to engage in passions and projects outside of work as well. And then the fourth thing under self-care is a bird's eye view, taking the wide view of things. You know, as humans, we are really wired to focus on the negative. And if things aren't going well at work, it's easy to become myopic and really focus on that. And sometimes we forget to balance it out with other things in our life that may be going all right or that are important to us. So it's important that as we move through this world that we focus on things that are not going well because we want to be attentive to them and try to manage them. But we also need to spend as much time and attention focusing on things that are neutral as well as positive in our lives. So those are just some of the self-care things that we can do. Next, we're going to jump to network. It's really important to have a strong professional support system and to network. Now, years ago, someone asked me, why should I network? I love my company. I've been with my company for many, many years. The department is great. I love the people I work with. I don't really understand why I need to be networking. I think there's a lot of different reasons for that, and I think it's especially important for women. One, it does help you stay fresh and creative and keep from being professionally isolated. You may have people that do what you do in your department or in your company, but it's always nice to get fresh ideas and fresh perspectives from people doing what you do outside of your company. Two, you never know how networking could somehow benefit your company, right? In terms of bringing more awareness to it or bringing more business. And three, it does create opportunities. And for those of you who love your companies and have been there forever, it's important to note that things may not always remain stable. There are market changes, there are industry changes that could impact your department or company. Maybe your boss changes and you don't like your new boss, or maybe the approach to how things are done changes in the company and you decide it's just not what it used to be. So it's always useful to network to create those opportunities for yourself, both in terms of local connections, really connecting not only across company, but outside of your company with professional and business associations, trying to do volunteer work that puts you in touch with other professionals, and board work. All of that is really, really critical. The second thing is trying to make sure that if you can, you have a mentor, someone who advises you, and a sponsor. A sponsor is someone who's within your company who advocates for you. They like your work, they want to see you get ahead, and they're going to try to make that happen. So those two things can often be invaluable. And then the third thing is your BOD, your personal board of directors. Now, when I was an early career person, I looked for a mentor, but mentoring wasn't something that was done in particular in my career all that much. And it was also difficult to find a mentor who could relate to some of the challenges that I faced as a woman and a woman of color. So one of the things that I did, and admittedly I should have done it sooner in my career, is I established a board of directors, a personal board of directors. Excuse me. This personal board of directors consists of friends and professionals I know who I can go to with questions, to brainstorm, to run things by before I send them out. Now, they don't have any real stake in my company. And certainly if you're employed by an organization, these are not a group of people who are going to have a real stake in your profession, but they're people who you can bounce ideas off of. And over the years, my board of directors has changed a little bit in terms of who's on it, but I have a particular formula that I like to have for my board of directors. One, I really like to keep my board of directors diverse. We know science says that diversity really helps companies, so why can't it also help me? So I make sure that my board of directors is pretty diverse in terms of including people who are at different stages of career, different sexes, different races, and even different industries. So for example, I do have people who do what I do on my board, but a lot of people on my board of directors are people who are in industries that are completely different than mine. And to be honest, some of my best ideas have come from them because the way they think, the way they look at the world, the way they navigate business is so different from how I do. So again, it's nice to have a diverse board in terms of age, race, sex, industry, and so forth. I like to have at least one champion on my board of directors, but just one. These are people who are unfailingly positive and are always there for you and rooting for you. But you only want to have one champion because they're so unfailingly positive, they can sort of steer you in the wrong direction if you're not careful. I like to have someone on my board of directors that's direct, someone who tells it to me like it is, even if I don't want to hear it. And I like to have someone who's an explorer on my board of directors as well. This is someone who doesn't tell me what to do, but constantly pushes me to question why I'm doing what I'm doing, why I'm thinking what I'm thinking. Could I be doing something differently? An explorer is one of the most valuable things, I believe, on your personal board of directors. Sometimes it can be a professional coach, but sometimes it can be a trusted colleague. And you want to make sure that if you have a board of directors that you're also giving back. So there are a couple of people on my board that really don't want anything back, but most of the people on my board of directors, I also do the same thing for in terms of brainstorming with them about their careers or their business. So let's move on to building brand. This is really important to do. You, as a professional, have a brand, whether you realize it or not, and it is critical that you're the one helping to form it. So it's important to, first of all, assess what your brand is. How do colleagues see you? How does your boss see you? Take a little inventory. Look back at previous performance reviews. What do people generally say about you? And if your brand is in line with what you want your brand to be moving forward, great. But if it's not, you want to start thinking about building your brand towards what you want it to be. And how do you determine that, first of all? Well, your brand should include, obviously, things that you're passionate about, things that are in your sweet spot, things that you do professionally that resonate for you, that you get excited about when you're working on. But I will tell you, passion is not enough in terms of building a brand. It's a starting point, though. You also want to assess what your skills and talents are and use that to inform your brand. What are the things you know? What are the things you don't know? And build your brand from there. You want to take into account what your ideal career niche is. And you also want to be incredibly mindful of what your company needs based on their objectives. And is there a way that your brand can help them achieve what your company needs? Or conversely, is there a way your brand can address your company's pain points? You know, the things that keep leadership up at night. And also take into account, if appropriate, any industry trends in your field in terms of formulating your brand. Once you assess and determine your brand, you want to make sure to get to know people, other people affiliated with that brand within or outside your company, and take advantage of lots of learning opportunities to continue to learn and build on your brand. So whether that's getting a mentor, whether that's through coursework or online certifications or books, you want to make sure to take on stretch projects that align with your brand, or if possible, create them yourself and collaborate with others across the organization so that they get to know you and your new brand. So for example, a while back, I was working with someone who was in the computer industry. And early on in her career, she was known for always getting the work done and always being someone you could count on, which was wonderful. But that's fine for an early career professional. As you move into mid-career, that's simply not enough. And she knew that. And so she wanted to rebrand herself as not only being someone who just works hard and gets the work done, but she decided based on her strengths and her interests and things she had observed within herself that she wanted to rebrand as a problem solver and a people person, someone who could work with difficult clients. So she established that brand, she messaged it out in different ways, she took on stretch projects that allowed her to establish her brand, and she ultimately ended up creating a brand new project which allowed her to address an issue that the company was having with a piece of hardware that again allowed her to further establish her brand as a problem solver and a people person. And so that's one example of how you can do that. Once you build that brand, I'm sorry, once you assess that brand, the second step is really marketing it out or pushing it out. I grew up thinking and being told that if you work hard, that's all you need to succeed. And that is an absolute fallacy, right? It is absolutely not enough to know stuff. It's about others knowing that you know your stuff. So you have to really market yourself. And marketing yourself has to be part of your work, has to be part of your job. It's important to always let your boss know what you're doing, let them know about any wins that you're having, things that you're working on. It's important to be really tracking your successes and try to enlist other people to kind of speak to your good work, obviously in a subtle way. And you should be doing the same for them. And most importantly, which I was not taught growing up, get up and get away from your desk and really connect across your organization or even outside of your organization. Because the reality is people like working with those they like and trust and know. And then the last piece is build credibility outside of work. This is really important for everyone, but especially women. And how do you do that? You can do that by taking on speaking engagements outside the workplace, maybe contributing an article to a trade journal in your industry. Maybe you join a board of a local nonprofit or connect with your professional organizations, but at the state and or national level. So it's really important to build credibility outside of your work as well in order to help build your brand. So obviously, given time, we've only covered just a few things in this piece of it, and we're going to move on in a second. But are there other things that people have done to help themselves navigate the workplace and deal with the glass or concrete ceiling? Amanda, do you want me to move on while people are writing in?
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, my sound cut out for a second. Can you repeat the
Oh,
question?
yeah. So this is only just a smattering of what women can do in the workplace. But I'm curious to hear from others. Are there things that they've done to help themselves navigate the workplace despite, the glass and concrete ceiling?
Gotcha, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, so I don't know if that cut out for everybody before, but there's the question again.
Okay,
Yeah, feel free to go on and I'll
sure.
give people some time to type.
Yeah. So next we're going to go on to what others really need to be doing. Because like I said before, yes, there's a lot of things women can do, but the onus is really on all of us to be working to kind of shut down these barriers that women face. So here are some things allies can do, and I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. One, really try to understand the challenges that are faced by women beyond sort of the obvious things, the more subtle, nuanced things. I would read up on things, listen to podcasts, learn about the issues, go to talks, and if someone is open, you can certainly talk to them about their experiences in the workplace as well. But it's always good to educate yourself and understand how these challenges play out for women day in, day out. The second thing you can do as an ally is to amplify others. If they're saying something in a meeting, if a woman is saying something in a meeting and they're not being heard, which sometimes happens, as we know, go ahead and amplify their voice. You know. Third, invite women to meetings or non-work professional events where sometimes women can be excluded, especially informal events where a lot of professional conversations may take place. Things that are typically branded as the old boys club. Understand your strengths and use them to see if you can mentor or sponsor someone who's really wanting that role in their life. 5, use your influence, whatever influence you have at work. So maybe you're someone who has a little bit of influence in terms of policies and procedures in the workplace. You can go ahead and use that to your advantage to try to knock down some of these barriers that women face. Maybe you're someone who's in charge of, bringing in speakers for brown bag lunches. Think about the kinds of speakers you might bring in to address these issues. Obviously, if you're someone who has some say in retention and recruitment, want to think about how you can eliminate some of the barriers there. Or maybe it's something as simple as instituting an employee resource group or an affinity group, things like that. And 6, speak up when you see something that's just not right. So an example of that is a few years ago, I was at a meeting and there was a discussion going on, and someone said something that was incredibly overtly sexist. And unfortunately, not everyone, but most of the people in their meeting agreed. And so I was quite taken aback. So I chimed in and I spoke up, but they didn't hear me at all. And they kept going with their conversation no matter how much I tried to explain it. And after a few minutes, a man at the meeting looked over at me and then he spoke up. He reiterated what I said and reminded them that I had said it, and then added further to the conversation in a way that was, as useful as what I said. Now, I was frustrated that the group couldn't hear me, but he did speak up and they were able to hear him and turn the conversation around and discuss it in a way that was much more useful. So anything you can do to speak up when you see something that's not right is always helpful. And again, my question is, we won't have time to go through all the things allies can do, but is there anything else that you have done or have seen done to support women that you felt was particularly useful in the workplace? Amanda, should I keep going?
Yes, I do have some comments that came in for the last question. Do
Perfect.
you want me to read those now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, just to go back a little bit.
Yeah.
So a few that came in, there's someone that's with us that is a female urologist, and she said she is in a Facebook group that is all female urologists. So they have a good discussion forum going there that they can all have a community in.
That's really
And
important.
let's see what else. Someone else is in the WICT organization, WICT, but unfortunately they found that it also can take time away from their real job.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a question that came in. Would you like me to save that for the end?
No, yeah, actually, if it's a question, yeah, that would be
Okay,
great.
okay.
Okay.
Then we can keep going.
Okay. And again, if anyone has any other things that they've actually done or witnessed that have helped support women as allies, please write in and share those ideas.
Yeah.
So the next piece we're going to talk about is what leadership can do. So yes, there are some things that women can do. And yes, it's important that people support each other in the workplace, including allies. But ultimately, it's the people with power in leadership who really set the tone for these kinds of issues in the workplace. But unfortunately, many leaders just simply don't know how to address D&I in a robust way, or they're just kind of checking off the box, if that makes sense. For me, one of the litmus tests is if I'm talking to someone who's high up in leadership for their organization, and the topic of D&I comes up, and they immediately sort of refer me off to HR to talk about it, that's usually a red flag, because people in leadership positions who are genuinely interested in D&I will talk your ear off. They're desperate to talk to anyone who has any kind of understanding about diversity inclusion, and they will talk your ear off about challenges they face, things they've tried that have worked, that haven't worked, and getting advice. So if someone directs you to HR, for me, that's usually a red flag. The other sort of litmus test is assessing where diversity is located in a company. And what I mean by that is a long, long time ago, I was, before I established my own business, I was applying for a job and someone higher up was giving me a tour of the organization. And towards the end, they happened to mention that diversity was really important to them and really important to their organization, especially racial diversity, but certainly not limited to. And I remember thinking, I didn't see much racial diversity in the organization, but the tour was limited and obviously I didn't get to see everybody, whatever, didn't think much of it. And I accepted the job. And I found out very quickly that there wasn't much racial diversity higher up in top leadership, nor was there much diversity in terms of gender. There wasn't much gender or racial diversity in middle management. There was a little bit of gender and racial diversity, in sort of the entry level positions, but where it really manifested robustly was in their buildings and grounds department. That's where their diversity was. And so much so that, once in a while I'd run into people and of course they ask, oh, where do you work? And I would tell them. And once in a while people would ask, oh, right, do you work in buildings and grounds? And I'd have to say, no, I'm I'm a psychologist. So that's an example of some red flags when you're talking with leadership. So what can leadership do? So one, it's important to be very clear about the frame. And I touched on this before, but this is something that's so critical that I want to touch on it again. Most companies really focus on D&I because of pressure, either because of compliance issues, regulatory issues, or because of risk management. Or they feel maybe forced to because consumers are demanding it in some way, shape, or form. The reality is most organizations want to thrive financially, right? Or they want to thrive in terms of having a broad talent pool to work from. They want excellent employees. They want employees to bring their best. And science shows that diversity really helps companies thrive. So it's important for leadership to think of it as an opportunity for growth versus sort of a box to check off. So the frame in which leadership looks at this is really important. It's really critical. Two, it's about making sure that D&I is at the heart of the commitment, that it's a really core commitment, as opposed to doing things here or there that have to do with D&I or perhaps listing that it's important on your company website, right? So for example, if you have a company with an unhealthy work culture, maybe even a toxic work culture as an example, you wouldn't then just bring in a ping pong table so that, employees have more fun at work. You wouldn't just message a feel good vision. You wouldn't just institute casual Fridays or have company parties to fix that toxic culture. You would do things that were much more substantive, right? You would address employee needs at work. You would address the structure and processes of the organization. You would want to address the politics of the organization. And you would want to really engage a vision as opposed to messaging it, right? It's the same thing with D&I. You don't want to do things here or there. You want to make it a core commitment. And ideally, this starts with leaders asking themselves certain questions, like, what are my D&I goals? What am I going to commit long term in order to make them happen? What do I need to do to educate myself in order to do this? Who do I need to help me with this, both within and perhaps outside the organization? How much time and effort am I willing to put into this? And how am I going to communicate the importance of this company-wide? So really looking at it as a core commitment and asking yourself these beginning questions. And then third, making sure to have a process, a real strategic plan versus activities. So for example, an employee resource group or an affinity group is okay. Diversity training here and there is okay. making sure you have a woman or a woman of color in the organization at a certain level. Those are all things that may be part of your D&I process, but those things can't be it alone. It really needs to be part of your strategic plan, and it needs to be an entire process as opposed to things here and there. And people who are looking at this being a process can ask themselves important questions like, again, why is D&I important for our organization? And what will it allow us to do? How will D&I look once it's achieved? And again, this is beyond numbers, right? It's not just the number of women that you have working. What has kept the organization, our organization, from achieving diversity and inclusion so far? Where is our organization right now in terms of diversity? And that means really taking a look at, for example, how you approach diversity from the time you announce a job to the hiring process, to retention, to support, succession plans, promotions. How do bias or microaggressions play out in the workplace? Asking yourself, what or who needs to be in place in order to support our strategic plan, right? What kind of experts do you need both within or outside the organization? What funding you need? What kind of other types of expertise you might need? Really creating a strategic plan and a timeline for D&I initiatives, making sure that you include metrics on how things are progressing. And again, metrics beyond numbers. You really want it to be about the experience of the people working there as well. How will people involved in D&I efforts at your organization, how will they be held accountable? So those are just some things that leadership can begin thinking about, again, just preliminary things, as they start thinking about more robust D&I for their company. Are there, and again, this is just a smattering of things, are there other things that you have seen leadership do to support women within your organization, within your company, or perhaps at another organization or company you worked at? That would be my other and last question for this audience.
Yeah, so everyone can take a few minutes to answer that question. I'm going to go back to the last question. A
Perfect.
few of you have commented just some things that you've been doing, and there's actually some themes here, so I'll just kind of combine some stuff.
Yeah.
One person said that they've switched career paths altogether. They gained some skills that were hard to utilize where they were, so they brought them to their new path and were able to enter another place at a much higher level,
Nice.
which is awesome.
Yes.
And then a couple others commented that they just have also seen that their facilities and support staff are the ones where they see the most diversity in their organization.
Just like the buildings and grounds, right? Yeah, that's very common.
Yeah, it is. And then let's see, what are a couple others here? A few of you have just been encouraging women to participate in as much as they can, and just be as proactive as they can in their work environments. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you're good. That's it.
Yeah, it's interesting. And one of the things, because someone actually said that they left and pivoted to something different. One of the things that you're finding that we've known about for a while, and I'm sure this audience knows, is that more and more women are going into business for themselves and becoming entrepreneurs, partly so that they don't have to deal with these kinds of issues. And it's sort of bittersweet. On the one hand, that's great, and on the other hand, it's sad that there are so many barriers that people feel that's the only way that they can sort of live their professional lives. I think ultimately D&I, it can be a really complicated topic, but the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. And to remember that D&I for women or anyone is ultimately about growth and opportunity for all individuals and organizations so that they can be and bring their best, because science has made it pretty clear that we simply go further when we go together.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Um,
Any other feedback about or any other thoughts about ways to support women, either if you're an ally or leadership?
Several people have said they've had specific managers at different companies that they've worked at that have just been that believed in them and that gave them big breakthroughs. So as far as leadership being a big
That's really,
entity in that.
yeah,
Mhm.
that's a really important piece, right? Having leadership that supports you and provides you with opportunities, things like that. That isn't always the case, but people are fortunate when they come across that for sure.
Mhm. Someone just said that they primarily like to work in minority organizations. That's really interesting
Mm, that
because
is,
they find the reputation of the company is integrated into everyone's job. That's really cool.
oh, yeah, yeah. hmm More and more people are demanding that in
Hmm.
terms of employers. I'm sorry, in terms of employees. And, hopefully leadership listens because, like I said, I mean, this talk was mostly about what women can do, and that's valid. But really, the onus is on all of us to be breaking down these barriers, whether it's for women or people of color, those who are differently abled, the LGBTQ population, so forth. So yeah.
Oh. So I'm pretty sure that's all the comments
hmm
that we have.
Okay. Any questions?
Yes, we do have questions. Okay, so I'll try and get through as many as possible, guys. I apologize in advance if we run out of time. Um, and I'll try to combine some if I see there's kind of a common theme. Um, there were a couple people that have asked what you recommend that they do if their leadership is another female and they're having issues with them instead of the stereotypical male dynamic.
Sure. Well, that's an interesting question. So, yes, I mean, you know, just because leadership may be a woman or a person of color or what have you, doesn't necessarily mean that D&I is always proliferating, in these kinds of organizations. To be honest, that question, the answer to that question depends on a lot of different variables in terms of what's going on, the context of the company, things like that. I mean, my first response typically is to be able to have sort of an honest conversation with the person and be able to say, what can I do to be advancing? What do you think might be holding me back? But if the person that's holding you back is actually in leadership, is your boss, whether it's a man or woman, that can pose all sorts of difficulties. And there are ways to sort of get at that, but sometimes it requires you kind of going over their heads sometimes. And unfortunately, a lot of that just depends on the dynamics going on in the workplace. Addressing it sometimes helps directly and head on. And for some managers, that's going to be a very dangerous thing for someone to do. So it really depends on the dynamics of the individual and the organizational culture around diversity and inclusion.
Okay, great. Um, okay, we just have a few more. Going back to the beginning of the presentation, I believe is when this popped up. So, what is the best way to go about finding that professional sponsor?
Within your company. I
Hmm.
think usually professional sponsorships, it's best if they can occur organically. Someone who is maybe higher up in the company that you end up having a lot of face time with anyway because of the work that your organization does, someone you connect with. Um, and, usually most sponsorships can occur organically where someone really is taking an interest in you and noticing the work. Um, and things like that. Once in a while, I don't personally find it optimal to go up to someone and ask them to be, your sponsor. Like I said, it usually happens organically. And again, if you're out there pushing your brand out within your company, That also means you're pushing it out to people you might normally not come across, because again, it's important to push your brand out across the organization. And in the process of doing that, you should be hopefully running into higher ups, who you're connecting with, maybe meeting with informally during the work, going out for lunches, things like that. And I think that that thing sort of just evolves over time.
Okay. Trying to mark them as I go here. How do you recommend vetting companies when you are job hunting? They said their last company was very toxic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, usually, I think it's really important to vet. I think it's really important to ask questions about, things like rates of turnover. Where do your employees typically go when they leave here? Um, if the turnover is high, have them explain that to you. Um, it's really important to try to be able to talk with current employees there as well. No one is going to come out, obviously, and say, well, this workplace culture is pretty unhealthy and we're pretty toxic and, you probably shouldn't be here. But how people respond to these questions, as opposed to the content, can really tell you a lot about a company. And there are obviously websites you can go to and look at and see what the company is like as well. But it's really important, if you can, to touch base with some of the current employees, and ask questions about where employees have gone once they've left here, and why.
Great. And I think we just have one more actually. So they asked, how can I influence the framing to leadership that diversity should be valued?
So I think if you're someone who is already in a leadership position, that becomes slightly, and I do mean slightly, easier, because you already have access to leadership. I will say most leadership, and of course this has simply been my experience, and this is not across the board, most leadership are interested in growing the organization, uh, financially and in terms of market share. There are some leadership that you can approach and say, well, this is a good thing and we just should be doing it. But in my experience, and again, this is just my experience, most leadership really don't respond to that. What they tend to respond to is numbers. And so if you can use the frame and use supporting numbers, and there's a lot of research out there that true diversity and inclusion, and by that I mean not just numbers, but the experience of those people in the workplace. Are they really being included and heard and promoted and blah, blah, blah? That kind of thing actually helps companies grow and become profitable and become stronger. And there are a ton of numbers out there to support how diversity inclusion helps the bottom line and innovation and creativity, stocks, things like that. So my bias is always to kind of lead with the frame, but pair it with the numbers, because unfortunately, in my experience, that's what works best.
Great, thank you.
You're
So I'm
welcome.
pretty sure I got to everyone. I might have missed one or two, and I apologize, but I want to also be mindful of everyone's time. So we're just going to stop there. Lubna, thank you so much for your presentation and the information that you shared. And thank you everyone for joining us today. And like I said at the beginning of the presentation, this was all recorded, the presentation, and I will also send out the email that includes the slides as well as the link to the recording so that everyone has that. And I probably will get that out early next week. It takes a little bit of time for it all to get together. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again, Lubna. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.